Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. We're stepping into a world that feels close enough to touch, yet belongs to a time long gone. The Victorians, and the strange, almost secret rules that shaped how they moved, spoke, and even lowered their eyes. It's the story of odd etiquette, not written in books or laws, but carried in gestures, whispers, and silence itself. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. It is late evening in a world that has long since disappeared, and yet, if you close your eyes, the gaslight still trembles on fogged glass and horse hooves echo against the slick cobblestones of London. The air smells of damp wool and coal smoke. Beneath it, always beneath it, lies something quieter, something less visible, the invisible architecture of manners, those invisible threads that held the Victorians together. And at the very heart of that web, heavier than a crown, though it was only a gesture, was the bow of a head. In an age obsessed with order, hierarchy, and appearance, silence was rarely empty. A bowed head was not simply humility, not simply a mark of politeness. It was a sentence written without ink. A man might ruin himself by lowering his head too long before the wrong person, or by holding it high when humility was demanded. A woman might invite whispers if her chin did not sink at the correct angle, or if her eyes dared to linger in the wrong direction. For the Victorians, the way one's neck bent, the rhythm of that tiny submission, was as binding as a legal document. And so the streets of London, the drawing rooms of Mayfair, the church pews filled with velvet-clad parishioners, they were stages for an endless choreography of heads inclining and eyes dropping. At dinner, in court, even at the threshold of mourning, this silent weight pressed down upon them all. But why should such a small gesture matter? To us, it may seem almost absurd, a fuss over posture. Yet in that century, to hold yourself improperly was to declare rebellion. And rebellion, in a society that lived by reputation, could cost more than pride. It could cost one's place in the rigid social ladder. It began, as so many things did in Victorian life, with class. The bow of the head, like the curtsy of a lady or the careful tipping of a hat, was a compass needle pointing directly towards status. The higher one standing, the less one bowed. A tradesman, cap in hand, might dip so deeply it seemed his spine would snap. A gentleman of moderate means bent only slightly, eyes carefully lowered, signalling both respect and a hope for acknowledgement. And the lords and dukes, who carried in their bones centuries of inherited power, often granted nothing more than the smallest nod, the kind that, in its arrogance, spoke more loudly than any speech. But beneath this hierarchy was another layer, almost invisible unless you lived within it, the rules of gender. For women, the bowed head was not optional. It was a necessity, stitched into every lesson from girlhood. From the nursery to the finishing school, daughters were taught to let their eyes fall. Their lashes shield them from direct stares. Their necks inclined just enough to convey modesty without civility. To lift the head too quickly was considered flirtatious. To linger too long with one's eyes downcast suggested weakness, perhaps even moral failing. A young woman's bow was as carefully calibrated as her corset strings, tight enough to hold her within society's expectations, but never so constricted as to choke. It was not only the act itself that mattered. It was when, where, and how. At church, the head bowed deepest during prayer, but never so long as to suggest ostentation. At funerals, the mourning veil might shadow a woman's lowered face, but woe to the widow who did not bow deeply enough before the casket. Among friends at tea, the head bowed slightly as greetings were exchanged, the chin dipping just enough to affirm intimacy without pretension. And for lovers, in those rare, dangerous moments of stolen encounters, a bowed head could conceal a blush or betray desire. Even children were not spared. Little boys in stiff collars were taught to lower their heads before elders, to demonstrate obedience in silence. Little girls were drilled in curtsies so early that their backs grew accustomed to bending. And though the gesture was small, the lesson was heavy. Your body was not your own. It was a language others would read before you ever spoke a word. Yet, like all languages, this bow carried contradictions. For while it was meant to signal deference, it also became a form of subtle rebellion. A too quick nod, a too shallow incline. These were quiet protests, invisible to most, but scorching to the trained eyes of society. The young clerk who dipped his head only slightly before his employer risked whispers of arrogance. The ambitious woman who delayed her bow, letting her gaze linger for a heartbeat too long, hinted at a daring not easily ignored. Entire stories unfolded in these moments. Entire reputations balanced on the invisible hinge of a neck. London itself seemed to move in these rhythms. Picture a street in Bloomsbury, rain slicking the stones, a maid hurrying with her basket, lowering her head as a carriage thunders past. Inside the carriage, a gentleman taps his cane, granting only the briefest nod to a passing acquaintance on the pavement. And there, across the street, a widow in black lowers her chin deeply to avoid the gaze of gossiping neighbors. This silent dance plays out countless times, never spoken of, never written in letters, but binding the city together as firmly as mortar binds brick. The consequences of failing to obey could be severe. A man who refused to bow might be accused of insolence, blacklisted from clubs, or quietly excluded from business deals. A woman who lifted her chin too boldly might be judged vain, flirtatious, or unworthy of marriage. Even in the courts, where justice was supposed to be blind, juries noticed whether a defendant bowed his head in shame or held it defiantly high. Judges, steeped in the culture of etiquette, read meaning into every tilt of the skull. A bowed head might mean repentance, an unbowed one, damnation. There are stories, half whispered, half recorded, of lives unraveling because of such gestures. A young governess, dismissed from her position not for any crime, but because her employer claimed she looked him too boldly in the eye. A merchant's apprentice accused of pride because he did not lower his head deeply enough when greeting his master in the street. Even a bishop, once adored, criticized in the papers for bowing too extravagantly before royalty, as if humility had become obsequiousness. The weight of these rules pressed not only upon individuals, but upon entire gatherings. Imagine the great Victorian ballroom, chandeliers blazing, gowns sweeping like tides of silk. Before a dance could begin, heads bowed in subtle acknowledgement, the music of etiquette preceding the music of violins. To miss the gesture was to miss a step before one even set foot upon the floor. And so the air shimmered with these unspoken exchanges, glances lowered, heads inclined, necks bent in orchestrated silence. And beneath it all, always, was the fear of being seen, not as one truly was, but as one's bow suggested. For the bow of the head was a mask, a curtain pulled across the theatre of society. Behind it, the Victorians hid their desires, their pride, their defiance. Yet the mask could slip, the curtain could falter, and in that instant, the truth might be glimpsed. And once glimpsed, it could never be unseen. Even in death, the bow lingered. At funerals, mourners bent their heads before the coffin, an acknowledgement not only of grief, but of the great hierarchy of mortality. In cemeteries, where stone angels bowed eternally over the graves, the gesture became immortalized in marble. The Victorians carried the bow with them into the afterlife, carving into stone what they had lived in flesh. And so, the silent weight of a bowed head was more than etiquette. It was a prison, a ritual, a stage performance that none could escape. It was the small hinge upon which lives turned, reputations rose or fell, and entire futures were decided. To bow was to survive. To bow incorrectly was to invite ruin. When we imagine them now, these men in stiff collars, these women in silks and veils, we may laugh at the absurdity of it. But listen closely, and the laughter falters, for beneath their rituals lies something that has not disappeared at all. Even now, in our own streets, our own offices, our own hidden hierarchies, we still bow. Not always with our heads, not always with our eyes, but in countless gestures of submission, of silence, of compliance. The Victorians only codified it, dressed it in lace and starch, and gave it rules we can still trace in the shadows. The gaslight may be gone, the horses silent, the coal smoke dissolved into history, but the weight of the bow, the silent acknowledgement of power, lingers still. And in that silence, London never sleeps. If the bowed head was the silent weight of submission, then the gloved hand was its whispering accomplice. In the same gaslit streets, where necks bent in ritual acknowledgement, another language was unfolding, one that did not need a single word. The Victorians knew it instinctively. A glove was never merely a glove. It was a message, an invitation, a curtain behind which entire lives were concealed. Few objects carried such power in the 19th century. Fabric wrapped around the hand, at first practical, against soot, against grime, against the filth of cities swelling with smoke and sweat, but soon became something more, a code. For in a society obsessed with appearances, the hand itself was too dangerous to leave bare. It revealed too much, the coarseness of labor, the delicacy of idleness, the tremor of desire. A hand ungloved could betray class, occupation, even inner thought. And so, gloves became the barrier, the uniform, and above all, the secret language of Victorian life. In drawing rooms and promenades, ballrooms and funerals, gloves dictated the terms of every encounter. A woman slipping her hand into a pale kid-skin glove was not merely preparing for company, she was arming herself with a shield. To remove the glove in public was almost indecent, unless done with the correct ritual, for the bare hand was not only flesh, it was intimacy exposed. The ungloved hand could not lie. It bore calluses or softness, rings or lack thereof, scars, stains or tremors. Thus, to wear gloves was to participate in the great illusion of the age, where everyone became what their attire suggested. Consider the ballroom, where heads bowed beneath chandeliers and gloves gleamed in candlelight. When a young man was invited to dance, he extended his hand not to the skin of a woman, but to the leather that concealed it. The glove-to-glove contact ensured that propriety was not shattered, that flesh did not dare trespass where only ritual was allowed. But even then, the Victorians discovered 1,000 ways to speak through gloves. The brush of fingertips could linger a fraction too long. The way the glove fit, loose, tight, immaculate, or slightly worn, spoke volumes. And when a glove was removed, carefully peeled away, finger by finger, it was more dangerous than a kiss. Etiquette books were explicit. Gloves must be worn outdoors, at church, at balls, at calls of social duty. They must be immaculate, never stained, never wrinkled, never frayed. To appear in society with soiled gloves was worse than appearing without shoes. And yet, beneath this rigid code, another set of rules thrived. Secret, unspoken, understood only by those who played the game. A lady who dropped her glove upon the pavement might not have been clumsy at all. In the eyes of the initiated, it was an invitation. If a gentleman stooped to retrieve it, he was entering a private exchange, one that hovered at the edge of propriety. If she allowed him to touch her glove, it was as though he had brushed her hand. And if she refused the return of it, leaving it behind in the dirt, then it was a dismissal, a cutting off sharper than any spoken word. There were stories whispered in drawing rooms, of lovers who passed letters tucked into gloves, of widows who carried the gloves of their dead husbands as if they were reliquaries, of duels that began not with insults, but with the contemptuous slap of a glove across a rival's cheek. Every glove carried the potential of scandal, of intimacy, of violence. For men, gloves were armor of a different sort. A gentleman was expected to own pairs for every occasion, white for balls, grey or black for mourning, tan for daytime promenades. A man who appeared without gloves was marked as careless, perhaps vulgar. But worse than being bare-handed was being incorrectly gloved. To wear coloured gloves to a funeral was not only improper, but offensive. To keep one's gloves on while shaking hands was a breach so grave it could stain one's reputation. The handshake, when permitted, demanded the intimacy of bare flesh, but only for men of equal standing. For a superior, one always remained gloved, preserving distance and hierarchy. Even in this, gloves spoke. The factories of England churned with kid leather, cotton, lace, and silk, feeding an insatiable hunger. Glove makers stitched not only fabric, but fortunes. For those who could not afford the luxury, there were cheaper imitations, stiff and uncomfortable, yet still mandatory for anyone hoping to move upward in society. And so the poor, too, played the game, squeezing their roughened fingers into tight-fitting gloves, hiding the proof of their labour beneath thin facades of gentility. Yet, as with the bowed head, these rules were never static. They shifted with fashion, with gossip, with the tides of morality. By the 1860s, ladies were expected to remove their gloves at the supper table, but only after the first course, and only with a delicate ritual of folding them neatly across the lap. To remove both gloves at once, to tug them off hastily, was to risk vulgarity. At the theatre, gloves were to remain on during the performance but could be shed in the interval, though to leave them carelessly draped over a seat was the mark of someone uncultured. The gloved hand became the stage for countless tiny dramas. Lovers in carriages, sitting side by side beneath the rattling of wheels, could not touch skin to skin, but a gloved hand brushed against another gloved hand might tremble with suppressed meaning. Mothers chastised daughters for fidgeting with their gloves, for twirling them in a way that might attract male attention. A young woman idly biting the tip of a finger to tug her glove loose was not innocent at all. It was a gesture ripe with suggestion, one that could set tongues wagging for weeks. And in the shadows of this etiquette, darker stories lurked. Gloves carried not only propriety, but contagion. The sweat of the tannery, the dyes used to stain them fashionable colours, sometimes poisoned the very skin they were meant to hide. Reports emerged of women's hands turning raw, blistered, even blackened by arsenic-laced dyes. Yet still they wore them, still they obeyed, for to appear bare-handed in society was more ruinous than the risk of sickness. Better to suffer in silence than to be seen as indecent. It was in mourning that gloves became most haunting. The black gloves of widows, sometimes crepe, sometimes silk, were not mere garments but symbols of devotion. They were worn to church, to social calls, even to bed, until the proper months of mourning had elapsed. A widow seen without her gloves too soon was condemned as heartless, as eager to rejoin society's pleasures. Entire reputations hung on the quiet presence of black leather upon fragile hands. Some widows kept them for years, folding them away in drawers, never daring to part with them, as if the gloves themselves held the last trace of the departed. Men, too, turned to gloves in moments of finality. In dueling, to cast down one's glove at another's feet was a challenge impossible to ignore. To strike a cheek with it was to demand blood. And though the age of pistols and swords was waning, the gesture remained, a relic of honour carried forward into an age of gaslight. In the great fog-drowned city, where every passerby was both stranger and spectator, gloves preserved secrets. They allowed men to grasp the hands of women they would never dare touch otherwise. They let women conceal letters, tokens, and even small amounts of money within their folds. They were worn by pickpockets and thieves to disguise the dirt beneath their nails, to slip unnoticed through the very etiquette they mocked. Even the police recognized it. A man caught bare-handed in the wrong quarter of London might be assumed a labourer, but a man in gloves could pass as a gentleman until the cuffs closed upon him. And as the century wore on, gloves became not lighter, but heavier in meaning. They were stitched into the fabric of every gathering, every ritual, every interaction. To live in Victorian society was to live gloved, not only in hand, but in spirit. Every truth veiled, every touch softened, every gesture encoded. So much of the age's silence, its repression, its double lives, can be traced to these soft prisons wrapped around fingers. They carried whispers of desire, shields of propriety, and the faint scent of leather that clung to parlors and carriages alike. And when a hand finally slipped free, when skin met skin in defiance of the rules, it was not a mere touch. It was rebellion, raw and electric. The Victorians did not need to speak of this. They knew. They carried the knowledge in every dance, every dinner, every funeral procession. The glove was both cage and key, silence and speech. And in their world of shadows and whispers, sometimes the greatest secrets were spoken without a single word. In a city where heads bowed like clockwork and gloved fingers whispered unspoken secrets, one gesture remained more perilous than either. It was the simplest of human actions, the most ancient of greetings, and yet in Victorian society, the handshake was not a matter of mere courtesy. It was an intrusion, a crossing of borders, a dangerous exposure of flesh to flesh. What to us is an ordinary civility was, to them, an act laced with risk, intimacy, and scandal. To extend the hand bare, unguarded, was to breach the carefully constructed fortress of distance that Victorians spent their lives maintaining. Etiquette manuals, those thick volumes of rules and prohibitions that sat on parlor shelves, made the matter plain. Not all people were to be greeted with a handshake. Many, in fact, were not to be touched at all. The handshake belonged to men, and even among men it was restricted. Two gentlemen of equal standing might clasp hands briefly, but never too firmly, never too long. A weak grasp was condemned as effeminate, but an overly strong grip was vulgar, almost aggressive. The proper handshake was a delicate balance, firm enough to suggest integrity, light enough to preserve refinement, brief enough to avoid impropriety. Anything more was viewed as a transgression of bodily restraint, that most sacred of Victorian values. But even here, rank intruded. A man of lower station was not expected to extend his hand first. To do so was to risk humiliation. If he reached out to one above him, the hand might be ignored, left suspended in the air, a silent reminder of his place. The higher-born might grant a handshake if they wished, but it was a gift to bestow, not a right to claim. In this way, even the clasping of palms became another instrument of hierarchy, another lever of power. For women, the matter was infinitely more delicate. A lady was never obliged to accept a handshake, and indeed, most etiquette writers warned against it. A bow, a curtsy, a gloved nod of acknowledgement, these sufficed. The touch of a woman's hand was reserved for the most private of circles. To offer it freely in public risked whispers, for the handshake bore with it a dangerous intimacy. Flesh touching flesh could suggest familiarity, even desire. A woman who permitted it outside of family or closest friendship might be judged bold, forward, even scandalous. Thus the streets and salons of Victorian Britain were filled not with handshakes, but with gestures of distance, tipped hats, inclined heads, gloved nods, graceful curtsies. The absence of touch was the point. To touch was to pierce the veil of decorum, to acknowledge that the body beneath the clothing was real, warm, and vulnerable, and this was something Victorians could not bear to expose too freely. Still, handshakes did occur, and because they were rare, they carried immense weight. A handshake between businessmen could seal a bargain more firmly than ink. A handshake at the end of a quarrel could signify not only forgiveness, but a pact of silence. To shake hands was to acknowledge equality, a mutual recognition that both parties stood on common ground. For this reason, many avoided it altogether, for to take another's hand was, in a sense, to admit they were your equal. Better to bow, to nod, to glide past untouched, and preserve one's superiority. Doctors, too, learned the dangers of this small gesture. In an age haunted by disease, cholera in the gutters, consumption in the parlors, typhus stalking the slums, to clasp another's hand was to risk more than propriety. It was to risk contagion. The medical journals of the century are dotted with warnings of infections carried by skin-to-skin contact, of germs that could not yet be named but were feared nonetheless. The handshake, once a sign of trust, became in some circles a vector of dread. Many carried handkerchiefs or scented gloves, not only as fashion, but as barriers. To grip another's bare hand was to gamble with one's health. The paradox deepened in religious circles. In churches, where one might expect warmth and fellowship, the handshake was largely absent. Worshippers bowed their heads, inclined their bodies, but rarely touched. Touch was too human, too fleshly, too suggestive of the body's frailties. Instead, the faithful exchanged looks, murmured greetings, or shared the silence of prayer. It was only in certain sects, later in the century, that the handshake of peace emerged, and even then it carried suspicion, as if this small act of human contact might loosen the tightly bound seams of Victorian restraint. In politics, however, the handshake crept forward as a dangerous tool. Candidates on hustings, eager to appear men of the people, would stoop to grasp the hands of tradesmen and farmers, the very act scandalizing their peers. The newspapers recorded it with relish. Here was a man willing to soil his flesh with the touch of the masses. To the working poor, such a handshake was electrifying. A glimpse of equality, if only for a second. To the upper classes, it was theatre at best, debasement at worst. The very notion that the same hand that signed Acts of Parliament might clasp that of a coal-stained labourer was enough to send shivers through drawing rooms. And yet, despite all this, the forbidden handshake lingered in private as something more potent still. Lovers, unable to embrace in public, sometimes dared only the briefest brush of fingers, a secret clasp beneath a table, a fleeting connection in the shadows of a garden. To them, the handshake was more charged than any kiss. It was illicit, dangerous, and therefore unforgettable. What society condemned as vulgar, the heart transformed into ritual. The world of crime, too, knew the handshake well. Among thieves and gamblers, it became a code of trust and betrayal. A grip too strong, a palm too damp, a hesitation before release. These betrayed nervousness, dishonesty, weakness. A seasoned pickpocket might disguise his intent with a friendly shake, slipping rings from a victim's hand while pretending to greet them. Even the police were aware. To watch the handshake of two men in an alley was often to witness the birth of conspiracy. The dueling ground, though fading from respectability, retained its own customs. To refuse a handshake after an exchange of blows was the ultimate insult, a mark that no reconciliation had been reached. Conversely, to extend one's hand, bloodied and trembling, was to declare the matter ended, honor restored. In such contexts, the handshake was not merely etiquette, it was fate, life, or death. Etiquette manuals devoted entire sections to this single gesture. They instructed young men never to offer the left hand, never to shake while wearing soiled gloves, never to extend a hand to a woman unless she gave permission. They advised that the duration be brief, 2 or 3 movements at most, and that the eyes should meet only for a moment, no more. The handshake, in these guides, was dissected with surgical precision, as if it were an explosive device that might detonate if mishandled. The strangest aspect, perhaps, was its absence. Entire generations passed without casual handshakes. Neighbors greeted one another with nods, relatives embraced rarely, acquaintances not at all. The Victorian body was a fortress, and its defences were many. Gloves, bows, curtsies, all were moats and drawbridges. The handshake, when it happened, was the lowering of the gate. No wonder they feared it. And yet, the more it was forbidden, the more it lingered in the imagination. Satirists drew cartoons of stiff-necked lords recoiling from the offered hand of a butcher. Novelists used the handshake as a secret code between characters, a moment of sudden intimacy that readers instantly understood as significant. The very rarity of the gesture made it symbolically rich. It stood for everything the Victorians denied themselves: openness, equality, the warm recognition of shared humanity. When the century waned, when the fog began to thin and the new world loomed with its telegraphs and railways, the handshake began to creep back into favour. Business demanded it. Empire demanded it. The age of contracts and treaties needed something quick, physical, binding. The handshake, once forbidden, became modern. But the old suspicions never entirely vanished. Even now, in certain circles, one can feel the faint echo of that Victorian unease, that fear of touch, that dread of what might be revealed in a simple clasp of hands. So it was that in parlours heavy with velvet, in streets drenched with soot, in halls where silence reigned, the handshake was not merely a greeting, it was a confession, a rebellion, a moment when the invisible walls trembled. For the Victorians, who wrapped their bodies in silence and their souls in restraint, nothing was more dangerous than to feel the warmth of another's flesh pressed against their own. And perhaps that is why it lingers still. That simple act, carrying more weight than we realize. For beneath the centuries, beneath the dust of coal and the rust of iron, the forbidden touch of a handshake still trembles, as if the Victorians are watching, reminding us that touch is never merely touch. Beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Victorian ballroom, where music swelled and gowns whispered across polished floors, there was another language, older than the orchestra, sharper than the glance of an eye. It unfolded not in words, but in flickers, in small movements of ivory and silk. The hand fan, delicate and light, became a voice louder than speech, yet quieter than a whisper. Within its fragile ribs and painted leaves lay a code so intricate that entire lives could be rewritten in the space of a dance. To the casual observer, a fan was simply an accessory, a shield against the heat of gas lamps, a decoration to complete a gown, a trifle to be twirled in idle hands. But the Victorians, who saw meaning in every tilt of the head and every press of a glove, knew better. A fan was not a trifle. It was a weapon, a secret ledger of desire and denial, a script performed without sound. The rules of society demanded silence from women. They were to be modest, reserved, spoken for rather than speaking. Yet the human heart, even beneath corset stays and rigid expectations, does not easily yield to silence. And so, within the confines of etiquette, women learned to carve out a space for themselves. The fan became their shield and their signal. It allowed them to express what lips could not utter, what letters dared not reveal, what eyes alone could not carry safely. The code was both simple and complex, depending on the hands that wielded it. To open a fan slowly was to declare indifference, a languid dismissal of whatever question lingered in the air. To snap it shut sharply was a refusal, as final as the slamming of a door. A fan held across the face suggested mystery, a veil of possibility. To let it drop to the floor, deliberately, never clumsily, was an invitation, the silent equivalent of beckoning someone closer. Every gesture was laden. To draw the fan through the hand suggested curiosity. To rest it against the lips asked for silence or secrecy. To twirl it idly was flirtation, dangerous and deliberate. And when the fan was held wide open, covering the chest, it was not modesty, but rejection, a shield against unwanted advances. This was not fantasy, but codified ritual. Manuals existed, tucked into the shelves of milliners and stationers, detailing the language of the fan. Whether every lady memorized such guides is debatable, but the very existence of these codes reveals how pervasive the idea had become. The fan was a script, a stage, and every woman an actress playing her part. Yet, like all scripts, it depended on the audience. A man ignorant of the fan's language might see only fluttering motions, an idle game of air, but those trained in its signals read volumes in every flicker. A courtship might begin and end in a single evening without a word spoken, communicated entirely through silk and gesture. The stakes were enormous. For in a society where one misstep could tarnish a reputation forever, the fan allowed the careful navigation of danger and desire. In the great houses of Mayfair, fans were painted with pastoral scenes or adorned with lace so fine it seemed spun from fog. In the more modest drawing rooms of clerks and shopkeepers, they were simpler, made of bone or wood, yet still wielded with precision. Across class lines, the fan became a universal dialect, one of the few tools women possessed to speak without being heard. The fan was not limited to flirtation. It could carry anger, disdain, sorrow. A widow in heavy crepe might still carry a black fan, opening it with slow, deliberate movements to remind the world of her grief. A mother, disapproving of her daughter's suitor, might snap her fan shut each time the young man approached, an unmistakable warning. Even friendships were nurtured or soured by the subtle play of fans across crowded parlors. But the true power of the fan was its duplicity. It allowed for two conversations at once, one public, one private. A woman might sit, surrounded by chaperones, her every word overheard, her every glance scrutinized. Yet within her hands, the fan moved with its own rhythm, carrying messages invisible to all but the intended recipient. In this way, the fan became the last refuge of secrecy in a world where privacy was nearly impossible. The objects themselves carried stories. Fans were often gifted, sometimes as tokens of admiration, sometimes as weapons of scandal. A fan gifted by a man to a woman was a dangerous object. Every flick thereafter bore his shadow. Some women collected them obsessively, filling drawers with painted leaves and carved sticks. Each fan a record of an encounter, a memory sealed in silk. Others clung to a single fan for years, its edges frayed, its colors fading, as if within it lingered some great secret they could never part with. And yet, like the gloves and the handshake, fans were also instruments of exclusion. They marked status as much as they conveyed secrets. To carry a fan of painted ivory was to announce one's wealth. To wield lace imported from France was to display one's connections. A woman with no fan at all was impoverished twice over, denied not only the ornament of fashion, but also the voice it gave. She was truly silenced. Even men, though rarely, were drawn into the game. Actors on stage sometimes used fans as props, exaggerating their movements to mock society's codes. Political cartoons lampooned statesmen who fluttered fans to satirize cowardice or duplicity. But in the private realm, the fan remained firmly in the hands of women, a rare domain where they could command the stage. The risks of misuse were real. To signal wrongly could end a courtship, ignite a scandal, or provoke rumors that might never fade. A misplaced flick of the wrist, a gesture misread, could destroy reputations. And so, like the bowed head or the gloved hand, the fan became another weight, delicate in form, heavy in consequence. The very air of a Victorian ballroom seemed to vibrate with this silent communication. Imagine the scene. The orchestra swells. Silk skirts brush the floor. The gas lamps burn hot overhead. 100 women raise their fans, opening and closing them in patterns as intricate as the notes of the music. To the untrained eye, it is a field of butterflies. To those who know, it is a storm of voices. 100 conversations running side by side, layered beneath the polite hum of small talk. And yet, for all its elegance, there was always a trace of desperation in the fan. It was a reminder that women were denied direct speech, that their desires, angers, and refusals had to be smuggled through the narrow gap of decorum. The fan gave them a voice, but only within the prison of silence. It was freedom, but freedom that could be taken away at any moment, should society deem the fluttering too bold, the signals too daring. Even now in the glass cases of museums, fans sit folded and still, their colors faded, their ivory cracked. Yet if one imagines the hands that once wielded them, the coded glances across crowded rooms, the heat of a dance where touch was forbidden, but signals blazed from every flicker, one can almost hear the voices again. For in their time, these fragile objects spoke louder than the loudest declarations, carrying the secrets of an age where silence was enforced, but never absolute. The Victorians built a world of restraint, but within its seams, rebellion always found a way. Sometimes it bowed its head, sometimes it lingered in a handshake, and sometimes it fluttered in silk, flickering like wings in the heat of gaslight, speaking what no voice dared to say aloud. The ballroom quiets, the music fades, and the crowd drifts from gilded salons into long dining halls where candles burn low, their wax dripping like slow clocks. It is here, beneath ceilings painted with myth and shadow, that another stage of Victorian etiquette begins. The dance of glances and fluttering fans gives way to the sharper ritual of silver and porcelain. For if silence could destroy a reputation, so too could a knife, not by violence, though knives had that history. Here, at the long mahogany tables where lords, merchants, widows, and daughters sat in uneasy company, a knife's danger lay in its position, its gesture, its relationship to the plate. Among the endless rules of Victorian dining, which fork for the fish, which spoon for the custard, there existed one commandment so often repeated, so deeply carved into etiquette books and whispered by governesses that it hardened into law. Dinner knives must never cross. At first glance, it seems absurd. Why should the mere crossing of knives bring scandal? But the Victorians believed the dinner table to be not just a place of eating, but a theatre of civility. To cross knives upon a plate was to invite disorder, a small rebellion in a world obsessed with order. Two blades laid in opposition resembled quarrel, conflict, aggression. It was said that crossed knives foretold arguments yet to come, that they attracted ill luck, that they unsettled the delicate peace of the table. A proper guest, upon finishing a course, aligned their knife and fork side by side, their blades facing inward, resting politely on the plate. To cross them was to break the line, to shatter the harmony, to announce, whether intentionally or not, discord. And discord was the one dish never permitted in a Victorian dining room. There is an image that lingers from those candlelit suppers, rows of hands moving with rehearsed precision, porcelain clinking softly, the air thick with roasted meats and perfumed sauces. Each guest, no matter how hungry, performed their role as carefully as a violinist in an orchestra. They did not stab, they did not scrape, they did not lean forward as if at home. The table was a battlefield disguised as harmony, and the weapons were hidden in plain sight. To cross knives, even by mistake, was to suggest carelessness, or worse, hostility. It was as though one had brought the violence of the outside world into the sanctuary of the dining chamber. Some mistresses of the house, watching keenly from the head of the table, were said to punish their children or servants if they dared leave knives astray. Guests who erred risked quiet censure, exclusion from future invitations. Their names murmured in drawing rooms as examples of what breeding had failed to correct. Superstition, too, shadowed the rule. Many Victorians inherited the older belief that crossed knives were omens of strife, that they summoned quarrels in the household or portended bad fortune. To leave them crossed was not just sloppy but dangerous, as if by their very arrangement blades could summon unseen arguments to life. Mothers corrected their children with whispers not only of manners but of luck. Straighten the knives, or expect tempers to rise before morning. The knife itself was a charged object. Unlike spoons and forks, it bore an ancestry of danger. Centuries earlier, men had brought daggers to table, laying them beside their trenchers of bread. To eat was to be armed. But by the Victorian age, this crude past had been scrubbed away, replaced by polished silver blades dulled for safety, their function ceremonial as much as practical. Yet the memory of violence lingered in their shape. The Victorians, attuned to symbols, treated knives with caution. To cross them was to awaken what civilization claimed to have buried. Etiquette manuals spoke of it with quiet severity. Mrs. Beeton, the great household authority, gave entire passages on the correct placement of cutlery, ensuring that the table mirrored the discipline of the home. In her vision, the dining table was the heart of moral life. It taught restraint, order, patience, values mirrored in every correctly laid knife. To break those patterns was to let chaos seep into the family itself. The rule extended beyond the meal's end. Even when knives were laid aside between bites, their placement mattered. A knife abandoned carelessly across the plate suggested vulgar appetite, as though the diner had thrown down arms mid-battle. To rest it neatly along the edge showed composure, refinement, control. Guests were observed constantly, their gestures weighed for meaning. A misplaced blade revealed more than bad manners, it revealed the character beneath. There were whispers, too, of those who used crossed knives deliberately. A woman wishing to reject the attentions of a persistent suitor might signal her displeasure by crossing them on her plate. A host, displeased with his guest, might let his utensils fall into that forbidden X as an omen. To those who believed, the sign was unmistakable. Conflict hung in the air like smoke, and still, the superstition persisted in quieter homes, away from the gilt dining rooms. In cottages and boarding houses, the rule survived as folk wisdom. A knife dropped to the floor foretold a visitor. Crossed knives warned of quarrels. Housewives straightened them not for show but to guard against misfortune. What began in the polished halls of London filtered down into kitchens where knives were plain steel, not silver, yet carried the same weight of omen. It is easy now to dismiss such fears as trifles, yet in the rigid atmosphere of Victorian life, trifles were never small. The knife was not just a tool, it was a measure of one's belonging. To move it correctly was to prove you understood the choreography of society. To err was to betray ignorance, to mark oneself as an outsider. And in an age where exclusion could mean ruin, no detail was too minor. Picture the scene, the clatter of many courses, servants gliding in quiet efficiency, the flicker of gaslight across polished silver. Conversation drifts from colonies abroad to gossip closer to home. Yet beneath it all lies a tension, an invisible string binding every guest. Each hand moves carefully, placing knife and fork in exact positions. Every gesture is watched, judged, remembered. The knives never cross. The peace of the table holds. And yet, beneath the order lies unease. For the rule reminds us how fragile harmony truly was. One mistake, one mislaid blade, could summon whispers of conflict. The Victorians lived in fear of disorder, social, moral, domestic, and their knives betrayed that fear. They were not weapons now, but symbols, their silence more telling than their edge. The fan could speak, the glove could signal, the bow of the head could shield. The knife, however, could not lie. It sat upon the plate, mute but eloquent, declaring harmony or quarrel, fortune or misfortune, refinement or vulgarity. To cross it was to break the unspoken covenant of peace that governed every dinner table. And so, in candlelit halls and humble kitchens alike, the rule endured. Knives never crossed, for to cross them was to break more than etiquette. It was to disturb the fragile architecture of civility itself, to remind those gathered that beneath their silks and polished manners lay the shadow of violence, never entirely banished, only restrained by ritual. The meal would pass, the courses consumed, the plates cleared. Guests would rise, bow, curtsy, and drift back into the parlours, their reputations intact, so long as the silver had stayed aligned. But the memory lingered, sharpened by every rule observed. In a world balanced so delicately, even a knife at rest could speak louder than words. When the laughter of the dining hall faded and the last drops of wine were left trembling in their crystal stems, another silence always loomed over the Victorian home. It was not the cultivated silence of bowed heads or fluttering fans, nor the polite restraint of silver knives aligned on china plates. It was the silence that came with death. Death was never far from the Victorian imagination. It lingered in the air like coal smoke, thickened by epidemics, childbirth gone wrong, accidents on the railways, or fevers that spread faster than prayers. Where life was fragile, mourning became not an exception but a cycle, one that demanded its own set of rules, codified in fabric and ritual. And of all those rules, none carried more weight than the etiquette of mourning black. The first sight of mourning black in a household altered everything. Heavy crepe-draped windows, black ribbons marked door knockers, mirrors were veiled in dark cloth to prevent the spirit of the dead from being trapped within. And most of all, the living clothed themselves in shadows. A woman whose husband had died was transformed overnight. Yesterday dressed in silk the colour of champagne. Today a figure swallowed by black surge, her very presence announcing absence. But the rules of mourning black were not simply about the colour itself. They were about gradation, duration, and precision. Queen Victoria herself, after the death of Prince Albert, became the eternal emblem of this etiquette. She withdrew into black for 4 decades, transforming personal grief into national ritual. Her choice created an expectation. To mourn deeply was to mourn visibly, and to mourn visibly was to mourn in black. There were stages. Deep mourning was the first and most severe. For widows, it demanded full black attire, crepe dresses without ornament, black veils thick enough to obscure the face, black gloves, black bonnets. Jewellery, if worn at all, had to be made of jet, dull, fossilized coal polished to catch light without sparkle. Diamonds were banished. Pearls, too white, too alive, were forbidden. Even handkerchiefs bore black borders, as though grief must stain even the act of drying tears. A widow in deep mourning could not host dinners, attend parties, or participate in society. She was expected to live as if she herself were half departed, a living ghost moving quietly among the living. The duration varied, a year, 2, sometimes longer, depending on the closeness of the death and the pressure of social expectation. After deep mourning came second mourning, when fabric softened and veils grew lighter. Black satin or silk might replace crepe. Small ornaments, subdued yet allowed, crept back onto bodices. Friends, upon seeing the subtle shift in texture and sheen, knew that grief was easing, not vanished, but altered. Finally came half mourning, when grey, lilac, or mauve entered the wardrobe. These pale colours signalled a transition, a cautious re-emergence into the world of the living. Every stage spoke volumes. To appear in mauve too soon was to invite gossip that one's heart was too light, that grief had not been honoured. To remain in crepe too long risked accusations of morbid display or of clinging too tightly to sorrow. There was no escape from scrutiny. Even grief itself became a public performance. Men were not untouched by these rules, though their burden was lighter. A black armband, a mourning band on the hat, a sombre suit, these sufficed. For children, white often mingled with black, their youth acknowledged in lighter fabric. Servants, too, adopted mourning colours in households that had suffered loss, for grief belonged not only to family, but to the house entire. But it was women, always women, upon whom the heaviest weight of mourning black fell. They became moving monuments to the dead, their every hem and veil reinforcing the memory of what was lost. Their bodies were draped in absence, their voices softened by expectation. To be seen in black was not only to declare one's sorrow, but to embody it, to make grief a constant, inescapable presence. Superstition breathed through the fabric as much as etiquette. Black was not simply solemn, it was protective. To wear bright colours too soon was to tempt fate, to invite further misfortune. Black guarded against the envy of spirits, against their desire to reclaim the living. Some believed that to leave mourning too quickly might anger the dead, as though the departed lingered at the threshold, watching to see if they had been forgotten. And yet, beneath this solemnity, mourning black became an industry. Drapers and seamstresses thrived on the constant demand. Shops specializing in mourning attire lined streets, their windows filled not with the brightness of fashion, but with layers of shadowed cloth. An unexpected death meant a rush to the dressmaker, for to appear even a day late in proper mourning was to court scandal. Death was universal, but proper mourning was a privilege of those who could afford endless yards of crepe. The poor did what they could, dyeing old garments black, reusing veils, or simply making do with ribbons and bands. Their grief was no less real, but society measured sincerity by the depth of fabric. The rules even extended into correspondence. Letters were sent on stationery bordered in black, the width of the line corresponding to the closeness of the death. A thick border declared immediate loss, a thinner one, more distant mourning. To receive such a letter was to understand, before even reading the words, the gravity of the news. Mourning was not merely lived, it was written, mailed, carried across cities in the folds of ink and paper. But for all its rigidity, mourning black carried contradictions. It was both armor and prison. It gave women a socially acceptable shield. No man of honor could press courtship upon a woman in deep mourning, yet it also confined them, locking them into silence and seclusion, sometimes for years. Young widows in particular bore the cruel weight of it. Bound in black at 25, their prospects faded long before the veil lifted. There are stories, too, of women who found in mourning black a kind of power. The veil became a mask, a way to move unseen, their features blurred, their grief unquestioned. Some discovered freedom within its constraints, wielding sorrow as protection. Others withered beneath it, their own lives eclipsed by the constant reminder of death. The drawing rooms and ballrooms that glittered with silver and silk always carried this shadow. Behind every jeweled gown stood the possibility of sudden transformation into black. Life could turn to mourning overnight, and society demanded the living embody that change without falter. There was no space for private grief. The rules of mourning black made sorrow a public obligation, and so the Victorians walked through their days in a choreography of loss. They bowed their heads, they adjusted their gloves, they held their fans like weapons, they aligned their knives with care. And when death entered their homes, they wrapped themselves in shadow, as though to remind the world that they carried absence upon their shoulders. To live in that world was to live always half prepared for mourning, to watch the silk gowns of the ballroom shimmer, knowing that at any moment those same gowns might vanish, replaced by crepe and jet. The etiquette of mourning black was not an oddity, not a small footnote, but a central law of life itself. It was the final rule that bound the Victorians together, reminding them that no matter how glittering their tables, no matter how silent their gestures, the shadow of loss waited just beyond the candlelight. And in that shadow, society found its order. Death was inevitable, mourning was ritual, black was the color that made sorrow legible, transforming private pain into a public performance that all could read, all could judge, all could never escape. The streets of the Victorian city were crowded, not only with carriages, clattering hooves, and the smoke of industry, but also with rituals as strict as those inside drawing rooms. Society did not stop when doors opened to the world outside. It followed, spilling onto pavements, promenades, and parks. And there, amid the gas lamps and clipped hedges, one object fluttered into prominence, as necessary as a fan in the ballroom or a veil in mourning: the parasol. To modern eyes, a parasol might appear a dainty accessory, a fragile shield against the sun. But in Victorian hands, it was more than shade. It was a moving curtain, a mask, a tool of subtle performance. Its lace or silk canopy, embroidered and edged with ribbons, was less about the harshness of daylight than about the harshness of society's gaze. Beneath it, women moved through the public world with the illusion of privacy, carrying with them the possibility of whispers too soft to be overheard. The parasol belonged to a culture obsessed with complexion. Pale skin was the mark of leisure, proof that one had not labored under the sun. A freckle was more than blemish. It was evidence of exposure, of proximity to toil, and so the parasol was carried like armor against the smallest kiss of sunlight. But it was never held merely as protection. The way it tilted, the angle at which it dipped, the timing of its opening or closure, these became part of a second language, a continuation of the silent codes that governed every gesture of Victorian life. Two women strolling arm in arm along the gravel paths of Hyde Park, their parasols angled just so, could speak volumes without uttering more than a word. A slight tilt forward suggested discretion, a desire to cloak their words from passers-by. A slow turn, as if catching the breeze, allowed for a secret glance to be exchanged across the space of a crowd. When lowered deliberately to the shoulder, the parasol became an invitation to conversation, to confidence, to something more dangerous. Unlike the fan, the parasol was not confined to interiors or evenings. It was a companion of daylight, visible to all, and therefore doubly potent. To raise it abruptly in the presence of an approaching gentleman could serve as shield, refusing eye contact without the risk of impoliteness. To let its lace edge tremble near one's cheek was a form of display, an accentuation of modesty that often drew attention all the more. Even silence on a city street had its choreography, and the parasol was its conductor, but its whispers carried beyond flirtation. Parasols were tools of gossip, moving tents beneath which reputations were dissected. In the pauses of afternoon walks, a cluster of women might incline their parasols together, creating a small canopy that shut the world out and drew their circle in. Behind those veils of lace, scandals grew, alliances formed, suspicions seeded. What was spoken beneath the parasol was spoken as if in confidence, yet it would often ripple outward, spreading like perfume in the air. The materials themselves bore meaning. Lace parasols suggested delicacy and refinement, the possession of wealth to afford what could tear in an instant. Heavier silk models, dyed in shades to match gowns, displayed fashion's excess. Black parasols, particularly in the hands of widows, reminded the world of loss, extending the rules of mourning into the very sunlight. Even the handle told a story. Ivory or mother of pearl bespoke privilege. Carved wood suggested more modest means. A parasol was not a trifle. It was a social signature. Men, of course, did not carry them. Their sun was not to be shielded, their skin not required to remain pale. The parasol was firmly gendered, a symbol of femininity bound in lace and fabric. Yet men read their meanings with interest, for a parasol could obscure the expression of a woman's fake even as it framed it. To catch the eyes that peered out from beneath was to feel as though one had glimpsed a secret not meant for daylight. The parasol's role in courtship could not be ignored. Etiquette books cautioned women not to play too freely with their parasols, for an idle twirl could be read as forwardness. Yet restraint was not always observed. Young women found in the parasol a rare space for mischief. To spin it lightly as one walked was to suggest liveliness. To let its lace flutter against the edge of a gown was to draw attention to the figure beneath. The object gave cover not only from the sun but from the scrutiny of guardians. Beneath its canopy, a smile could be hidden, a whisper passed. And still, for all its lightness, the parasol carried a weight not unlike morning black or crossed knives. It demanded propriety in its very use. To let it drag on the ground was vulgar. To snap it open too briskly unladylike. To carry it clumsily across one's shoulder careless. Mothers corrected daughters. Mistresses corrected maids, all reminding the next generation that every movement of the parasol reflected upon the household. It was not enough to own lace. One had to wield it with grace. What fascinates now is the layering of silence upon silence. The bowed head spoke, gloves spoke, fans spoke, knives spoke, and here too, in the open air, parasols spoke. The Victorian world appears, from a distance, full of talk, sermons, speeches, novels, yet its truest conversations unfolded without sound, in symbols that hovered like ghosts between the living. The parasol's whispers were part of that endless chorus, as fragile and ephemeral as lace itself, yet as binding as law. There were moments, too, when the parasol turned from ornament to shield. In crowded streets, where men pressed too near, it could be angled as a barrier. A quick lift of its edge could block a stare, cut off an approach, reassert the invisible boundary between propriety and intrusion. Its fragility was deceptive. Behind its silk ribs lay the firm authority of etiquette, and few dared to cross it. Some parasols survive still, tucked in museum cases or preserved in trunks. Their lace yellowed, their silk brittle. To look at them now is to see fragility. But to imagine them in motion is to recall the invisible webs they spun across crowded promenades. They were at once barriers and invitations, whispers and shields, objects that carried within their delicate frames the entire architecture of Victorian restraint. The city itself seemed designed for their passage. Wide promenades, public gardens, seaside resorts, all became stages for the parasol's performance. Even in the glare of summer, the world of etiquette persisted, woven into every shaded glance. To stroll without a parasol was to appear careless, perhaps even coarse. To carry one with skill was to step into the theatre of public life, with the confidence that one's role was understood. And so the whispers behind lace parasols wove themselves into the fabric of daily life, binding private thoughts to public performance. They concealed as much as they revealed, cloaking secrets in lace, turning gossip into ritual, transforming the very act of walking into another chapter in the endless book of Victorian etiquette. Beneath those fragile canopies, reputations shifted, affections sparked, scandals brewed. The parasol was not only a shield against the sun, it was a shield against exposure itself, offering the illusion of privacy in a society where nothing was truly private. And in that illusion, it carried both danger and salvation. In the same parks where parasols cast their shadows and fans once fluttered in drawing rooms, there was another kind of silence at play, less visible than lace and yet more rigid than steel. It was the silence of space, the space that separated men from women. This was not the casual gap of strangers crossing paths. It was a rehearsed choreography, a system of measurements more exact than inches, learned almost unconsciously from childhood. In the Victorian world, propriety could be gauged by the distance between a gentleman's sleeve and a lady's glove, by the breadth of air allowed between two figures walking side by side, by the invisible line that divided a ballroom into safe approaches and dangerous intimacies. The rules seemed so ordinary then that few questioned them. Yet, to modern eyes, the idea of regulating air itself appears almost unthinkable. But in a society where reputation was currency and honor as fragile as lace, the space between bodies was never left to chance. A young lady, for instance, could never walk arm in arm with a man unless he was kin. To do so otherwise suggested familiarity, and familiarity was the slippery slope towards scandal. The width of a parasol or the span of a book was often placed, figuratively, if not literally, between them. When walking together, etiquette dictated a deliberate distance, one that declared to passers-by, here is respect, here is virtue, here is nothing that need trouble your imagination. In carriages, too, the placement of bodies told its own story. A gentleman might sit opposite a lady, never too near, his posture carefully arranged to avoid even the suggestion of intrusion. To brush accidentally against her gown, even in the jolt of a turn, required apology. To linger in that closeness without acknowledgement was dangerous, for such silences could be interpreted as intentions. And in the Victorian theatre of appearances, intentions mattered as much as actions. The most sacred of spaces was the dance floor. There, men and women could at last approach, but only under the watchful eye of the world. A gloved hand upon another gloved hand, a measured step, a polite bow. Even in waltzes, which scandalized earlier generations for bringing bodies too near, the closeness was permitted only because it was framed by ritual. Every twirl was timed, every hold brief, the danger of intimacy carefully contained within choreography. One might imagine such rules to be restrictive, and they were, but they were also strangely liberating, for they gave structure to desire. Within the narrow confines of what was forbidden, small transgressions carried enormous weight. To allow a momentary brush of fingers when passing a teacup, to lean just slightly closer in conversation, to close the distance by a breath's width. These gestures rang louder in a world where space was measured so precisely. That measurement extended into speech. A man did not presume to address a woman without introduction, and even once introduced, there were topics that could not breach the distance between them. Politics, money, private feeling, these were barricaded behind silence. Polite conversation drifted instead toward weather, books, travel, all safe enough to be spoken at arm's length. But beneath these safe exchanges, the true communication often occurred in what was not said, in the pauses and the spaces where words faltered. Etiquette guides insisted this distance protected women. They were to be guarded from impropriety, from forwardness, from the possibility of being compromised. Yet, in practice, the distance was also a boundary that men could exploit. For to hover near that invisible line without crossing it allowed them to imply what could not be spoken outright. A gentleman could circle a lady in words and gestures, testing the edge of propriety like a sailor tracing a dangerous coast, all the while maintaining the fiction of respectability. This invisible geometry shaped every public gathering. In churches, pews often divided men and women, or families sat arranged so that no stray glance lingered too long. In gardens, benches were curved to allow two to sit without facing directly, ensuring that conversation tilted away rather than toward intimacy. Even staircases bore their rituals. A gentleman might precede a lady upward, so that he did not gaze immodestly upon her, but he would follow her downward as if to shield her from behind. The architecture of the age mirrored these distances. Parlours and drawing rooms were designed with clusters of chairs, never too close, so that conversation could flourish without impropriety. Tables were large, even for small meals, to ensure that a knife or a glass created a respectful barrier. Bedrooms were banished entirely from polite society. The very word bed was often avoided in conversation, so deeply did propriety measure the air between bodies. What lingers most, however, is not the rigidity of the rules, but the intensity of the atmosphere they created. Imagine the tension of a crowded ball, where eyes scanned every pair that stepped too close. Imagine the hush of a garden walk, where a gentleman slowed his pace just enough to close the space between himself and his companion, and she, aware of the eyes upon her, tilted her parasol to restore the gap. These were not small gestures. They were negotiations of reputation, each measured inch as meaningful as a spoken vow. And though the rules insisted on distance, they also ensured that desire remained ever present. In the pauses, in the careful avoidance of contact, in the weight of what could not be touched or said, romance was amplified. The Victorians lived in a world where the absence of closeness became its own kind of intimacy. The space between men and women was not empty. It was charged, vibrating with what society forbade, but individuals still felt. Occasionally, of course, the rules faltered. A stumble in a dance, a jolt of a carriage, a gust of wind turning a parasol. Such accidents could collapse the measured distance in an instant. And in those moments, propriety demanded immediate correction. A bow, an apology, a retreat into formality. But sometimes, such accidents lingered in memory far longer than hours of polite conversation. The mere touch of a hand, however accidental, could carry a thrill that haunted both parties, precisely because it was not meant to happen. Looking back, it is easy to see these rules as suffocating, even cruel, yet they reveal a society profoundly aware of the power of space, of the way bodies inhabit the world in relation to one another. Where modern eyes might see empty air, the Victorians saw possibility, danger, temptation. They measured their morality not only in words and deeds, but in inches, in the invisible lines that divided propriety from ruin. And in that distance, entire lives unfolded. Marriages were negotiated without touch. Affections were nurtured in glances. Scandals were born of too much proximity. The measured space between men and women was less an emptiness than a stage, and on it, every gesture was magnified, every step choreographed, every silence heavy with meaning. There was a peculiar choreography on Victorian streets, one that unfolded not in the drawing rooms or at the dinner tables, but in the grey light of morning, in the fog of dusk, upon cobblestones slick with soot and horse sweat. Here, where men in stiff collars and polished boots wove between carriages and gas lamps, etiquette hung in the air like smoke. Even a gesture as fleeting as the tipping of a hat was weighted with consequence, its meaning shifting with the smallest angle of a brim. To lift one's hat was never merely practical, not a matter of cooling the brow or brushing away ash. It was a salute to an invisible order, a performance of respect that spoke in silence. A gentleman, encountering a lady upon the street, would not call out, would not raise his voice above the hum of wheels and hoofbeats. Instead, he would tilt his hat, not high enough to suggest familiarity, not so low as to appear servile, But at that precise middle point where acknowledgement was unmistakable yet modest, the oddity lay not in the gesture itself, but in its restrictions. The rules did not command men to tip their hats to faces. Instead, they demanded the acknowledgement of status, position, even presence, a recognition that could, at times, extend to shadows. A gentleman might raise his hat as a lady's carriage rolled past, without glimpsing her face behind the glass. He might offer the gesture to a figure glimpsed across a square, a silhouette rather than a person. What mattered was not intimacy but ritual, not the individual but the role they occupied in the great machinery of appearances. A lady, for her part, was not expected to return the gesture. To reach for her bonnet, to adjust the pins that held her hat in place, would have been considered indecorous. Her response was subtler, lighter, a brief inclination of the head, a flicker of acknowledgement through lowered eyes. Her restraint was as much a part of the etiquette as his flourish. To do more would have tipped the balance from formality into familiarity, a transgression watched closely by those who measured every movement in public space. But hats, like gloves and parasols, were not neutral objects. They were props in a silent theatre, and each gesture was studied. A gentleman who failed to lift his hat to a lady risked far more than appearing forgetful. He risked the quiet judgment of those who observed, the whispered suggestion that he lacked breeding, or worse, that he intended insult. Etiquette made no room for accident. Even if his mind was occupied, even if his hands were full, the failure to tip was recorded, a silent strike against his standing. There were stories of men who made too much of the gesture, lifting their hats with a flamboyance that drew attention, or holding them aloft longer than necessary. Such theatrics were ridiculed, for they violated the unspoken rule of balance. To be too eager in one's courtesy was to appear insincere. To be too restrained was to appear rude. The correct tipping of a hat was thus not a casual motion, but a kind of performance that required rehearsal, a signal delivered with the precision of a bow on a violin string. Even the material of the hat altered the meaning. A silk top hat carried a weight of respect that a worn felt hat could never achieve. The tipping of a fine hat was a declaration of rank, a silent reinforcement of hierarchy. To remove such a hat entirely, to hold it in one's hand for more than a moment, was a deeper courtesy, reserved for funerals, processions, or solemn encounters, where the weight of silence demanded more than a fleeting tilt. In some cases, men tipped their hats, not to individuals, but to spaces. Passing a church, a gentleman might lift his brim in reverence, whether or not worshippers lingered near the doors. Passing a funeral carriage, the same gesture marked his acknowledgement of grief, even if he did not know the deceased. These were moments where hats were lifted to shadows, to unseen presences that etiquette demanded be honored. The street itself became a stage, lined with rituals performed for those who might not even be watching. What is striking now, looking back, is how much power rested in such a small act. In the thickness of London fog, a hat raised at the right moment could affirm bonds of civility. Withheld, it could rupture them. Imagine the narrow alleys off Fleet Street, where clerks hurried past shopkeepers, or the wide avenues of Mayfair, where carriages rattled in endless procession. In both, the tilt of a brim was watched, registered, remembered. A forgotten tip could be interpreted as disdain. A repeated flourish could breed suspicion of mockery. All of it mattered because in a society bound so tightly by appearance, every gesture was an echo of character. There were darker undertones too. A woman walking alone could be subjected to hat tips that were not gestures of courtesy, but insinuations, weighted with meanings she dared not acknowledge aloud. A gentleman who tipped too low, who held his hat too long, might be pressing toward impropriety without ever speaking a word. The gesture's ambiguity was its danger. The same movement that conveyed respect could also carry suggestion, depending on the eyes that interpreted it. Etiquette guides of the era devoted pages to instructing young men on the proper manner of doffing their hats. They warned against extremes. No hat should be waved like a flag. No brim snapped so briskly as to appear mocking. The hand should move smoothly, confidently, without trembling or hesitation. In those details, one sees how the Victorians invested even the smallest acts with moral significance. A clumsy tip was not merely inelegant, it reflected poorly on a man's character, suggesting carelessness, impulsiveness, perhaps even disrespect. The gesture extended indoors as well. Upon entering a lady's home, a man was expected to remove his hat entirely, holding it until it was taken from him by a servant. To forget, to linger with the hat upon his head, was an offence as grave as speaking out of turn. The removal of the hat was not only a courtesy, but a symbolic act. He entered the house, stripped of status, humbled before its domestic order. To replace the hat too soon upon departure was equally frowned upon, as though eagerness to escape revealed a lack of gratitude for hospitality. Perhaps the strangest element of all was the persistence of the gesture in the absence of witnesses. There are accounts of men lifting their hats as they passed memorial statues, or as funeral bells tolled for names they did not know. In those moments, the act was not for the benefit of another's eyes, but for the performer himself. The tipping of the hat became a ritual of belonging, a way of situating oneself within the grand moral order that stretched from gaslit streets to shadowed churchyards. It was a salute, not to a person, but to the weight of custom, to the unseen authority that governed every movement of the age. If one imagines the Victorian city as a great machine, its gears grinding in rhythm with bells and carriage wheels, then the tipping of hats was like the oil that kept it from seizing. Each tilt smoothed over the friction of daily encounters, affirming hierarchies without words, preventing offense without speeches. In a world where silence carried meaning, the lifting of a brim spoke volumes. The oddity is not that men tip their hats, but that they tip them to so much more than people, to shadows, to symbols, to the very fabric of society itself. They tip them to remind themselves of their place in the hierarchy, to honor grief they did not share, to acknowledge presences they could not see. In that gesture, fleeting yet endlessly repeated, one glimpses the heart of Victorian etiquette, the belief that even the air between people must be governed, that no moment of encounter could be left unshaped by ritual. And so, in the grey streets under the gas lamps, where fog blurred faces and shadows stretched across cobblestones, hats moved like quiet signals, raised not to intimacy but to order, not to faces but to roles. They preserved the fragile balance of a society that measured respect in inches, gestures and silences more than in words. Not all etiquette lived in parlours, on promenades, or under gas lamps. Some of its most intricate rules thrived in the silence of writing desks, where pen, ink, and folded paper carried burdens heavier than conversation ever could. The Victorians, who measured distance in footsteps and bowed heads, also measured it in the curve of a sentence, in the angle of a folded page, in the pressure of a wax seal pressed upon an envelope. Letters were not simply correspondence, they were performances, laden with unspoken meaning, scrutinized as though every stroke of ink might reveal too much. The act of writing itself was bound by etiquette. A young woman, for instance, could not pour her heart onto paper without restraint. Every word was weighed, not only for its sentiment, but for its propriety. To sound too eager was to risk her reputation. To sound too cold was to risk her suitors. Even the greeting, "My dear sir, my dearest friend," to Mr., was a battlefield where affection, distance, and duty collided. The paper mattered. Heavy cream sheets bore authority, their texture suggesting seriousness and wealth. Thin, delicate sheets whispered intimacy, easily folded, easily concealed. The color of the paper carried its own meaning. Ivory for polite exchanges, mourning black edged with solemnity, pale blue for a gentleness that skirted the edge of the sentimental. To select the wrong stationery was to betray oneself before the ink was even dry. And then there was the hand itself. Penmanship was more than utility. It was a portrait of character. Upright, steady letters suggested discipline and good breeding. Sprawling, ornate flourishes hinted at vanity or carelessness. A lady whose hand wavered too much risked the suspicion of nervousness or instability. A man whose script sprawled aggressively across the page seemed reckless, uncontrolled. To receive a letter was to read not only its words, but its very strokes, as if the ink itself betrayed the hidden soul of the writer. The wax seal, however, was where the unspoken truly lay. To modernize, it is a quaint detail, a blob of hardened crimson stamped with a crest or a flourish. But in the Victorian world, the seal was not decoration, it was declaration. Its colour carried coded messages: red for passion, black for mourning, gold for formality, green for friendship. The emblem pressed into it, a monogram, a crest, even a borrowed symbol, could alter the meaning entirely. To break a seal was not only to open a letter but to trespass into the intimacy it guarded. Some whispered of seals broken not by accident but by curiosity, by the prying eyes of servants or family. The etiquette surrounding this was ruthless. To tamper with another's correspondence was not only impolite, but criminal in spirit. Yet, suspicion lingered that such breaches happened often, particularly in households where alliances, inheritances, or courtships depended on what was written in secret. A wrongly sealed letter could upend lives, for etiquette insisted that the seal was sacred. To mishandle it was to insult both writer and recipient alike. The strangeness lay in the contradictions. Letters were meant to be private, yet they were rarely free from scrutiny. A daughter's letters were sometimes intercepted by her parents, a wife's letters by her husband, a servant's letters by her employer. Entire households might become silent audiences to words meant for one pair of eyes. Etiquette demanded discretion, but it also demanded control, ensuring that no message traveled entirely unobserved. The folding of the paper, too, carried its rules. A letter folded too casually, with edges uneven, suggested haste or indifference. A letter folded crisply, with care, suggested respect. Some folded pages inward, concealing the words against prying eyes. Others folded outward, as if declaring confidence. Even the way the wax was placed, centered, off to the side, pressed lightly or with force, could be read as a subtle sign of mood. To those attuned to these details, the envelope became a silent language, as telling as any sentence within. For courtship, letters were perilous territory. A gentleman who wrote too often appeared desperate. One who delayed too long appeared disinterested. A lady, meanwhile, had to balance warmth with reserve. Too many flourishes, too many underlined words could hint at impropriety, and yet, within these narrow confines, the smallest departures spoke volumes. A slightly less formal salutation, an extra line of farewell, a wax seal pressed with unusual care. These tiny deviations hinted at feelings that etiquette forbade being spoken aloud. It is no wonder, then, that letters became both lifelines and weapons. A misplaced phrase could ruin a woman's name. A too bold declaration could brand a man indiscreet. Families guarded correspondence fiercely, for the wrong words, once discovered, could unravel engagements or taint reputations. Entire court cases turned on the existence of letters, proof of promises made or improprieties committed. And so, writing was at once an intimate act and a dangerous gamble. Each letter sealed not only with wax but with risk. The postal system itself added another layer of strangeness. Before the penny post, letters were costly, and the recipient, not the sender, often bore the expense. This made the receipt of a letter both an honor and a burden. After postage became affordable, correspondence flourished, but so too did anxieties. With more letters came more opportunities for error, more occasions for etiquette to be tested. The sight of a postman at the door could quicken the heart with expectation or chill it with dread, for no one knew whether the sealed paper within would carry affection, obligation, or ruin. Etiquette manuals advised young women never to write first, lest eagerness betray them, and young men to avoid too frequent replies, lest intensity shame them. Letters became dances on paper, the space between words carrying as much weight as the words themselves. To To sign yours sincerely was not the same as yours faithfully. To end abruptly with yours was colder still. Each phrase bore a temperature, calibrated with care, as if emotion itself had to be distilled into degrees of politeness. And then there were the letters that never reached their destinations. Some burned in fireplaces before they could be read, destroyed by cautious hands that feared discovery. Some lingered unopened, their seals intact, carried to graves as relics of what could not be spoken. Others were intercepted, redirected, read by eyes that had no right to them. In every case, the fate of the letter became as much a part of its meaning as the words inside. A sealed envelope in a drawer spoke of secrecy, an opened one, of exposure. What remains most haunting is how the Victorians lived under the weight of appearances, even in their most private words. The very act of writing, of folding, of sealing, became part of a performance for society, even when no audience was intended. A letter was never simply communication. It was a mirror of reputation, a shadow of propriety pressed into paper and wax. Today we might marvel at the strangeness of it, to live in a world where every scrap of paper carried such peril, where even the thickness of a fold or the gloss of a seal could determine how one was judged. But in the Victorian imagination, the written word was alive, carrying not only thought but morality. A letter was a fragment of the self, sent out into the world, vulnerable to interpretation, to distortion, to betrayal. To mishandle it was to mishandle the person who had written it. Thus, the rules grew ever more elaborate, binding even ink and wax in their invisible chains. And as candles burned low upon writing desks, as pens scratched across midnight paper, as wax dripped and hardened into crimson seals, the Victorians lived not only in the presence of each other, but in the presence of their words. Words that could not be unsent, shadows that could not be unseen, rituals that bound silence as tightly as speech. Letters, after all, were never sealed with wax alone. They were sealed with fear, with longing, with caution, and above all, with the unyielding weight of etiquette which lingered long after the ink had dried. There is an odd silence in the heart of Victorian society, one that does not come from bowed heads or folded letters, but from the absence of names. Among the many rules that governed parlours and promenades, one of the strangest was the etiquette of withholding introductions. In a world where every glance was measured, where distance between bodies carried moral weight, even the speaking of names was treated with suspicion, as though familiarity itself were dangerous if granted too freely. To encounter a stranger in public was not, as it might be now, an occasion for casual greeting. A gentleman passing another gentleman on a fog-soaked street might acknowledge him with a tilt of the hat, but that acknowledgement ended there. Words were dangerous, names were doors, and doors were not opened without permission. To know someone's name was to be admitted into their world, to be granted access to their reputation, their history, their place within the labyrinth of class and propriety. The Victorians, ever fearful of impropriety, locked such doors firmly shut. Consider the ballroom, that grand theatre of etiquette. There, young women in white gowns lined the walls, their gloved hands folded, their eyes cast down beneath chandeliers. Young men circled like shadows, yet none could approach without being properly introduced. It was not enough to admire, not enough to exchange glances. Without the intervention of a hostess or a mutual acquaintance, the distance between them was unbridgeable. To bypass this ritual was unthinkable, an insult to propriety, a threat to the carefully maintained order of appearances. The strangeness of it lay in its rigidity. A lady and a gentleman could dance together all evening, their hands briefly clasped, their voices rising above the music. Yet when the candles were snuffed and the carriages departed, they returned to being strangers. Without formal introduction, the exchange ended at the edge of the dance floor. The next morning, should they cross paths upon the street, neither could speak the other's name. They had shared proximity, glances, perhaps even sparks of unspoken understanding, but society demanded silence, as though the night had been erased by dawn. This ritual of not being introduced extended far beyond ballrooms. In drawing rooms, a lady might sit across from another for an entire afternoon, sipping tea from the same porcelain service, yet leave without knowing her name. If no host connected them, the silence remained intact, as though they occupied separate worlds despite the nearness of their chairs. The air between them was heavy with restraint, a refusal to acknowledge existence beyond the shallowest courtesies. Such silence was not accidental, it was deliberate. The refusal to introduce oneself was a form of self-preservation. To cross that line unbidden was to appear forward, vulgar, untrained in the codes that governed society. A man who announced himself to a lady without mediation marked himself immediately as unworthy. A woman who presumed to speak her own name risked worse. Whispers of boldness, accusations of impropriety, the suggestion that she was too eager for attention. In a culture where reputation was as fragile as glass, silence was often safer than speech. There was also a hierarchy in these rituals, one that mapped neatly onto class. The higher one stood in society, the less one needed to speak. It was the duty of others to arrange introductions, to build the bridges of acquaintance on one's behalf. To step forward uninvited was not only to risk rudeness, but to betray one's social position. Those of lesser rank could not presume access. Those of greater rank could withhold it indefinitely. The very act of not introducing oneself became a subtle reinforcement of hierarchy, a way of ensuring that boundaries were not only visible, but audible. And yet, within this silence, currents of meaning flowed. To decline to introduce two people was itself a kind of statement, a judgment rendered by omission. A hostess might withhold an introduction to signal disapproval, or to prevent alliances she found unwise. A gentleman might ignore another's presence, signaling contempt without uttering a word. Absence of names could wound more sharply than spoken insult, for it was not only silence, it was erasure. For those trapped within this etiquette, the longing for names became palpable. Imagine the drawing room filled with strangers, the murmur of polite conversation circling without ever alighting. One could sit in such a room for hours, exchanging glances, interpreting gestures, hearing voices, yet never breaching the wall of namelessness. There was intimacy in such silence, a peculiar closeness that came from being near yet unknown, like two figures seated back to back in the dark. The tension of withheld words was its own form of communication, more haunting than speech. Letters, too, bore the mark of this ritual. To address someone improperly, to presume a familiarity without sanction, was to invite disaster. Salutations were not casual choices, but delicate negotiations. A misused "dear" could imply intimacy where none was permitted. Too formal an address could wound pride. The careful withholding of names echoed the broader silence of introductions, reinforcing the idea that identity itself was not to be handled lightly. The rules stretched into the street as well. Two acquaintances, bound by propriety but not yet formally introduced, might pass one another daily. They might recognize each other's carriages, see each other across shop windows, even exchange polite gestures. Yet the silence of names remained intact, an invisible barrier stronger than iron. To speak was impossible. To remain silent was obligatory. And in that silence, entire relationships existed only in glances and imagined conversations. It was a world where invisibility became a kind of etiquette. The refusal to speak, the refusal to bridge the gap, was not absence, but presence, the performance of restraint. To modern sensibilities, it appears cruel, even absurd, that human beings should move so cautiously through one another's lives. Yet for the Victorians, it was precisely this caution that preserved society from collapse. Without these rules, they feared, chaos would enter, strangers would become too familiar, hierarchies would crumble, reputations would be compromised. Silence, then, was not emptiness but architecture, the scaffolding that held propriety upright. And within that silence lurked peculiar forms of intimacy. To not be introduced was also to be unbound by words. free to linger in the realm of speculation. A woman might imagine the name of the man who tipped his hat to her daily. A man might imagine the life of the lady glimpsed always behind her veil. These silent encounters created ghosts of acquaintance, half-known figures who haunted daily routines without ever becoming real. In this way, the ritual of not being introduced gave rise to entire shadow worlds of imagined connections, romances that never spoke their names, enmities that never declared themselves aloud. The ritual's power lay not in what it forbade, but in what it suggested. For when society closes its mouth, the imagination opens wider. In the hush of unspoken names, desire, suspicion, and fantasy grew unchecked. The Victorians, who feared impropriety in every gesture, created by their very silence a world far richer, far stranger, far more haunting than any spoken introduction could ever allow. Thus, in drawing rooms and on promenades, at balls and upon fog-bound streets, the absence of names became a presence all its own. Introductions withheld shaped lives as surely as introductions given. And in this elaborate theatre of silence, where people were near yet distant, known yet unknown, one finds perhaps the strangest etiquette of all, the art of remaining strangers, not by accident, but by design. In the stillness of Victorian drawing rooms, where words were withheld and introductions delayed, the body itself became an instrument of communication. And of all the unspoken signals that governed the rigid choreography of daily life, few were stranger than the rules surrounding one's feet. Shoes, those humble carriers of the body, were never merely practical. They became compasses of intent, silent declarations of respect, and, at times, damning evidence of impropriety. To let them point carelessly was to risk shame. To place them with precision was to uphold the invisible order of the world. It is difficult, from the vantage of the present, to grasp how heavily such rules pressed upon ordinary moments. Consider the simple act of entering a parlour. A gentleman did not stride in and scatter his feet where they pleased. His shoes were expected to align themselves discreetly, toes turned neither too far inward, which suggested weakness, nor too far outward, which implied arrogance. A woman, seated with her skirt falling in neat folds, was expected to position her shoes just so beneath the hem, visible enough to prove neatness, yet modest enough to reveal nothing suggestive. Even the angle at which her shoes pointed could be read as commentary on her upbringing, her modesty, her awareness of propriety. Crossing one's legs was a danger. For men, it could be tolerated in certain informal settings, provided the shoes remained aligned with civility. For women, however, it was nearly unthinkable. The wrong tilt of a shoe beneath the layers of silk could betray a suggestion of intimacy, as though her body were prepared to step beyond the sanctioned boundaries of decorum. Thus, women learned to keep their feet parallel, ankles close, toes resting like obedient sentinels upon the carpet. Entire manuals were written advising young ladies on how to rest their shoes while seated, as though their futures depended upon it, and perhaps, in some ways, they did. The streets, too, carried their peculiar geography of footwear. To walk down the Strand or across the gravel paths of Hyde Park was to move within an unspoken compass of expectations. Shoes pointed straight ahead, forward, purposeful, restrained. To let one's shoes point sideways while pausing too long by a shop window, to angle them toward a stranger in a way that suggested lingering interest. These were small rebellions, but noticed. Observers, trained by years of watching, read intent in the smallest deviation. Shoes pointed wrongly could spark whispers, and whispers in Victorian society had sharper teeth than open insults. Even in greeting, the alignment of one's shoes mattered. When two gentlemen stopped upon a pavement, their shoes were to face each other in measured symmetry. One did not leave a foot trailing askew, as though half turned away. That implied disinterest or insult. Among ladies, the arrangement was more delicate still. Shoes turned too directly toward one another suggested an intimacy unsuitable for casual acquaintances. Shoes turned too far apart could be read as coldness, an unwillingness to engage. To stand before another person in Victorian London was not only to meet eyes, it was to negotiate the precise direction of leather upon cobblestone. And at the dinner table, where knives and forks carried their own burdens of symbolism, shoes carried subtler meanings still. Beneath the heavy linens and mahogany tables, shoes were not idle. A gentleman's shoes remained firmly in place, heels grounded, toes forward, never intruding beneath the space of another. A lady's shoes rested in stillness, for any restless tapping was interpreted as vulgar impatience. Yet those who looked carefully, servants moving silently between courses or observant chaperones watching over their charges, could see more. A shoe nudged slightly forward, a toe angled toward a neighbor, could whisper volumes more than the polite chatter above. Entire courtships flickered into life beneath the tablecloth, conducted solely in the language of shoes, careful enough to escape censure, daring enough to breathe possibility. Church pews offered another stage for this strange etiquette. Worshippers knelt in rigid rows, their shoes aligned with military precision. The act of turning one's shoes wrongly, angled outward during prayer, or sprawling with careless posture, was seen not simply as indiscipline, but as spiritual laxity. Feet that did not conform betrayed a soul ungoverned by propriety. In some churches, older parishioners watched the young with hawk-like eyes, noting whether their shoes maintained the proper parallel stillness during long sermons. A misplaced shoe became a moral footnote, a sign that one's household had failed in its duties of instruction. And yet, like so many Victorian rules, the rigidity of shoes bred its own secret subversions. Lovers, forbidden to speak freely, might dare the faintest brush of shoe against shoe, hidden beneath the folds of skirts or the shadow of pews. Such fleeting touches, scandalous if witnessed, carried more intensity than embraces. Entire novels of longing were written into the accidental, or not so accidental, meeting of leather upon carpet. Shoes, bound so tightly by expectation, became instruments of rebellion, precisely because they were supposed to remain still. Even within mourning, shoes carried their burden. A widow dressed in deepest black was expected to let her shoes speak of her grief as much as her veil. Polished to a dull respectability, they carried her weight with a slow, deliberate step, never quick, never careless. To move too lightly was an insult to the dead. To scuff the ground with restless shoes was to dishonor the solemnity of loss. In this, the ritual of shoes blended seamlessly with the broader language of mourning, a choreography of grief inscribed upon the very ground. What fascinates most, however, is how these unspoken rules extended beyond mere observation into the realm of instruction. Etiquette manuals, those heavy-handed arbiters of Victorian behavior, were precise on the matter of shoes. A lady, one declared, must allow her feet to speak modestly for her character. Another warned gentlemen never to point their shoes toward a lady unless directly engaged in conversation, lest they appear presumptuous. The precision of such rules feels absurd now, and yet, for those living within the labyrinth of etiquette, every detail mattered. Shoes, like words, like bows, like gloves, were part of the machinery that kept society from sliding into chaos. And perhaps that is the haunting truth of these rules. Shoes were never simply shoes. They were the anchors of reputation, the visible proof of invisible restraint. They carried not just bodies, but entire histories, of households desperate to maintain appearances, of young women trained from childhood to sit with ankles crossed just so, of young men reminded at every turn that carelessness of posture was carelessness of soul. To step wrongly was to stumble socially, and society rarely forgave such missteps. In the great hush of Victorian life, where names were withheld and hands rarely touched, shoes became the silent storytellers. They pointed straight ahead when duty demanded. They lingered sideways when curiosity tempted. They brushed against another pair when desire dared to speak. They scuffed when sorrow overwhelmed restraint. Each movement was part of the unending theatre, each step a line in the unwritten script of propriety. To imagine London in those years is to imagine not only the rustle of gowns and the murmurs of voices, but the endless tapping and stillness of shoes upon stone and wood. Each one, whether polished or worn, narrow or broad, spoke its language to those trained to listen, and those who failed to learn the language, whose shoes betrayed them by pointing the wrong way, were not merely awkward, they were outcasts marked by their very steps as unfit for the endless ritual of Victorian life. The hush of shoes upon marble, the angles of feet held in silent discipline, all led inevitably to another theatre of judgment, the tea table. If the Victorian world was built on unspoken codes, then nowhere did they crystallize more cruelly than in the porcelain rim of a teacup. For tea was not simply a drink in that age. It was ceremony, spectacle, test, and sometimes execution. A single misplacement of spoon or saucer could unravel the delicate threads of reputation, and in parlours across London, fortunes and futures trembled in the hands of those too nervous to pour correctly. Afternoons belonged to tea. The clinking of cups was the heartbeat of drawing rooms, the punctuation of endless conversations that never said directly what they meant. The hostess presided like a priestess, her teapot a vessel of both welcome and scrutiny. Every gesture mattered, the way one received the cup, the steadiness of one's hand, the exact manner of stirring sugar. These were not trivialities, but signals read with the precision of codebreakers. For in a society obsessed with appearances, the teacup became a mirror, reflecting not just the tea within, but the soul of the person who held it. Consider first the simple matter of the handle. To grasp it too tightly suggested nervousness, even vulgarity. To let one's fingers sprawl too loosely across the porcelain was a greater sin still, implying laziness or carelessness. Manuals instructed that the cup be held with the thumb and forefinger upon the delicate loop of the handle, the other fingers resting gently beneath for balance. But balance itself was treacherous, too rigid, and one appeared affected, too casual, and one appeared uncouth. The act of holding a teacup was not a thoughtless motion. It was performance, studied, rehearsed, watched by all. And then there was the question of lifting. One did not raise the cup without first raising the saucer, unless in the most informal of settings. To lift the cup alone, leaving the saucer behind, was to reveal ignorance. To lift both but hold them too far from the body suggested theatricality. To lift them too close suggested clumsiness. The wrist must remain straight, the elbow unobtrusive. Even the smallest tremor could betray nerves, and nerves betrayed weakness, and weakness invited whispers. But the true terror of tea lay not in holding but in stirring. The teaspoon, that fragile instrument, was to move in silence, back and forth, never in circles. Stirring round and round was not merely frowned upon. It was vulgar, noisy, a breach of refinement that could stain one's standing as surely as spilled tea upon silk. The spoon must never clink against the porcelain. The sound itself was a social crime. Imagine the tension of such a ritual, hands trembling beneath the eyes of an entire room, each guest listening not to your words, but to the absence of sound from your teaspoon. In that silence, even the faintest tap could echo like a bell of disgrace. Sugar, too, was fraught with peril. To take too much was a mark of greed. To take none at all, without explanation, was a sign of affectation, and heaven forbid one should bite into a lump of sugar directly. That was a crime so great it was spoken of in etiquette manuals with tones of near horror. Milk, likewise, was a battlefield. There were households where milk was poured before the tea, and others where it followed after. To choose wrongly was to risk revealing one's origins, one's class, one's lack of refinement. The order of liquid in a cup became a subtle fingerprint, exposing truths people worked desperately to conceal. And always, always, the eyes watched. Hostesses measured their guests as carefully as chemists weighed powders. The teacup was the instrument by which they judged breeding, composure, and respectability. A woman might be admired for her beauty, a man for his wit, but let either falter in their handling of tea and admiration curdled into mockery. Reputation, built over years, could topple in minutes. All because a spoon clattered or a saucer wobbled. It is not difficult to imagine the quiet terror this bred. Picture a young girl, newly invited into a household above her station. The parlour is warm with gaslight, the carpet thick, the walls lined with gilt-framed ancestors whose painted eyes seem to watch. She sits with her gloves folded in her lap, awaiting the moment the teacup will be offered. Her hand trembles as she accepts it, the porcelain hotter than expected, the saucer slippery. All around her, voices drone in polite conversation, yet every guest is watching, waiting, measuring. One slip, one drop of tea upon her gown, one spoon clink too loud, and she will be remembered not as a promising acquaintance, but as a clumsy interloper. Nor was this scrutiny limited to the young. Even seasoned matrons and men of society feared the tea table, for reputations never ceased to balance upon its fragile porcelain. Entire rivalries played out across its surface. A hostess, offering sugar with calculated sweetness, might press a guest into choosing. Too much, and he seemed indulgent. Too little, and he seemed critical of her tea. Guests, in turn, read insults into the smallest delays or over-generous pause. Tea was not refreshment but duel, waged with smiles and spoons instead of swords. And beneath the apparent civility, tea had teeth. In whispered scandals, one hears of guests deliberately humiliated, cups filled to the brim so they might spill upon their clothes, spoons placed on the wrong side of saucers to confuse them, milk poured in strange orders to expose hesitation. These tricks, cruel though they seem, were part of the undercurrent of Victorian life, the unspoken warfare of status, where one's worth was tested in porcelain rather than in blood. Servants too knew the stakes. A spilled tray could undo years of faithful service. A misaligned saucer could bring scolding or dismissal. They, perhaps more than anyone, understood the precarious weight of tea. It was not only society's reputation balanced upon those cups. It was their livelihood, their survival, their place in the narrow corridor between invisibility and disgrace. And what of the silence between sips? For tea was not only about what one did, but when one did it. To drink too quickly was gluttonous. To linger too long over an empty cup was boorish. A guest must pace their sips to the rhythm of conversation, neither rushing ahead nor lagging behind. In that rhythm lay the ghostly music of propriety, as binding as any symphony. To drink at the wrong moment was to step out of tune, to mark oneself as untrained in the great orchestra of society. Strange, is it not, that a simple cup of tea could carry such burdens? And yet, when seen within the larger machinery of Victorian etiquette, it makes sense. Every gesture was a test. Every silence was filled with meaning. A society that forbade directness found its truths in the smallest details. The angle of shoes, the tilt of hats, the grip of gloves, the bow of heads, and here, the trembling porcelain between finger and lip. The teacup was merely another mask, another instrument in the unending performance of restraint. But masks, as always, sometimes slip. There are stories whispered of tea tables overturned, of guests fainting from nerves, of reputations shredded in an instant by a splash of liquid upon lace. Such tales are told with a kind of dark amusement, yet beneath the laughter lies the shadow of fear. For everyone knew it could happen to them. Everyone knew the cup might slip, the spoon might clink, the milk might pour the wrong way. Everyone knew the tea table was a trap as much as a comfort. And so, in the lamplit parlours of Victorian England, tea was sipped with steady hands and shallow breaths. Conversations drifted, laughter rose, but beneath it all lay tension, fragile and sharp as porcelain itself. In that tension, reputations were built and broken, lives elevated and destroyed. For in the end, it was not the strength of words that defined one's place in society, but the silence of spoons, the stillness of wrists, and the fragile balance of a cup that could, at any moment, slip and ruin everything. The clink of porcelain fades, yet the parlour does not grow any lighter, for the weight of reputation in Victorian households was measured not only by hands and gestures, but by the very fabric of the windows. To an outsider, curtains were mere decoration, velvet or muslin chosen to soften the light, to guard against drafts, to frame a respectable view of the street. But within the labyrinth of Victorian etiquette, curtains were far more than fabric. They were clocks without hands, silent sentinels of morality, and at times, executioners of reputation. One drew the curtains according to hour, according to season, according to occasion, and to fail in this ritual was to invite suspicion as surely as if one had shouted impropriety from the street. The world outside watched houses as carefully as it watched people. Windows were eyes, and curtains were eyelids. If they blinked at the wrong hour, neighbours noticed. If they remained shut too long, tongues wagged. If they opened too early, speculation began to coil like smoke in drawing rooms across the block. Morning, for instance, carried its own silent demands. Curtains were to be opened with the first decent light, though not so early as to suggest disorder or sleeplessness. A household that flung its curtains wide at dawn appeared frantic, eager, or, worse still, as though it harboured servants with no training. Yet a household that kept them closed too long risked even darker whispers. Had the family overslept? Had sickness overtaken them? Was their grief concealed within? Or had indolence crept into their lives, staining their respectability with the suggestion of sloth? Even fabric could speak of sin. Afternoons, too, were bound to rules. Curtains were to filter the light but never shut it out completely, for daylight was the language of industry and order. To draw curtains against the sun in the middle of the day implied secrecy, an attempt to conceal some shame or indulgence. It was said, in hushed tones, that houses with curtains drawn at unusual hours were dens of ill repute, places where cards, brandy, or worse, scandalous encounters flourished unseen. A simple swath of velvet could transform a respectable house into a subject of fascination, its closed windows glowing like accusations in the street. And then there was evening, the most treacherous hour of all. With gas lamps flickering in the streets and coal fires glowing within, the question of curtains became urgent. Draw them too early, before dusk fully fell, and one suggested paranoia, as though fearing the eyes of others. Leave them open too long, and the household exposed itself, quite literally, to the scrutiny of neighbours and passers-by. A figure moving in lamplight behind sheer fabric became gossip before the hour was done. A gentleman walking too close to a lady in the glow of a drawing-room window could be transformed by rumour into a scandalous liaison. For the Victorians, privacy was a weapon, and curtains were the shields by which they wielded it. The etiquette extended even to mourning. A house struck by death was expected to draw its curtains in solemn shadow, their stillness signalling grief to the street. To fail in this duty was to dishonour the dead. To keep them drawn too long was to indulge in morbid display. The balance was precarious. 3 months for a parent, less for distant kin. Though each household bent the rules according to status and sensitivity, neighbours kept count, noting when light first reappeared in windows once darkened by loss. Too early, and the family seemed callous. Too late, and they seemed obsessive. Even grief was measured in fabric and hours. Curtains were also policed from within. Mistresses of households instructed servants with exacting precision. How wide to part the drapes, how evenly to fold them, how swiftly to respond to changing light. A careless servant who left a curtain half drawn might cause speculation that the household itself was careless. Those who drew them at improper hours risked reprimand or dismissal. For curtains were not simply fabric hung upon rods, they were the visible face of discipline, the outward signal of order within. And then there were the darker associations. Curtains left closed all day came to be linked with illness, with decay, with families hiding deformity or scandal. Some whispered that drawn curtains were the mark of houses where debts mounted or where madness lurked. Children were warned not to loiter near such windows, as though the shadow behind the fabric might seep outward and taint them. In a society that feared impropriety more than disease, the curtain became a veil not just against light, but against contagion of reputation. Imagine, then, the unease of a street lined with identical terraces, each household peering through its own fabric while watching the others. A single window out of step, curtains flung wide when others were closed, or closed when others were wide, became the talk of the neighborhood. A widow, still in black, who lifted her curtains earlier than expected, might find herself accused of seeking society too soon. A bachelor, whose curtains remained shut until noon, risked being branded dissolute. A drinker or gambler who slept through respectable hours. One's private rhythms were no longer private. They were broadcast to the street through the silent choreography of curtains. And yet, like every rule in that age, what was meant to suppress also invited subversion. Lovers used curtains as signals, drawing them at odd hours to indicate meetings arranged in secret. A curtain fluttering when no breeze stirred was read by some as invitation. Servants, too, learned to manipulate the ritual, leaving curtains slightly ajar to spy upon the street, or closing them deliberately to shield their own stolen moments from view. Fabric became code, understood by those who knew how to read it, invisible to those who assumed only propriety. It is tempting, perhaps, to dismiss such obsessions as trivial, but within the Victorian imagination, nothing was trivial. The house was not merely a dwelling, it was an emblem of moral order, a fortress of reputation, and the window, being the most public of its features, carried the burden of that order more heavily than any wall or door. A curtain drawn at the wrong hour was not a mistake of housekeeping, it was a crack in the fortress, a glimpse of chaos seeping through. And so, evening after evening, in streets where fog mingled with lamplight, hands reached for cords and rods, drawing fabric with practiced precision. The gesture was performed silently, but its meaning resounded. Each curtain fell like the closing of a stage, hiding the mysteries of the household from the ceaseless gaze outside. Yet everyone knew that a curtain could slip, that light could leak, that shadows could betray. And it was in those betrayals, brief as they were, that reputations trembled most. The teacup trembled in the parlor, the shoes aligned upon carpets, the gloves folded upon laps, all were part of the same ritual, the same endless theater. And the curtain, heavy with dust and silence, was its backdrop. For behind those drawn folds lay the truth of Victorian life. A world lived half in shadow, half in performance, where even fabric at a window could condemn or redeem. The curtain falls, the lamplight is dimmed, and for a moment the street outside lies still. Yet the silence that descends upon these Victorian rooms is not peace, but a kind of lingering breath, as though the age itself knows it is being watched. For this world, so precise in its gestures and merciless in its judgments, was already slipping toward its own extinction. And even as it vanished, it demanded one last act of obedience, a final curtsy before the gaze of history. Etiquette had always been less about kindness than about control. A bowed head, a gloved hand, a teacup lifted with exacting care. Each of these gestures was a line drawn against chaos. But the deeper one looks, the more fragile those lines appear. Behind lace and velvet, behind hats tipped and parasols angled, was an age haunted by its own contradictions. They claimed civility as their shield, yet lived in constant fear of misstep. They demanded composure, yet trembled at the thought of being exposed. What was this, if not a society rehearsing endlessly for a performance that could never end? The curtsy was its most distilled gesture, and perhaps its most haunting, performed in drawing rooms, at doorsteps, in ballrooms whose air smelled of gas lamps and perfume. The curtsy was a bodily acknowledgement of hierarchy. To dip one's knees and lower one's gaze was to confirm one's place in the order of things. Yet it was also a disappearing act, a gesture in which the self receded, swallowed into the performance of respectability. To curtsy was to vanish, to become less visible, less dangerous, less individual. And so it is fitting that the last echo of this age should be imagined not as a speech, not as a gesture of defiance, but as a curtsy, soft, silent, and vanishing. But to curtsy at the vanishing of an era was not a simple matter, for the Victorians clung fiercely to their rules, even as the ground beneath them shifted. Industrial cities swelled with smoke and unrest, yet drawing room etiquette grew more rigid. Newspapers filled with scandal and murder, yet the rules of mourning black were sharpened to a science. Women began to murmur of rights and suffrage, yet still they dipped their knees in the ritual of deference. Each rule became heavier, stranger, more desperate, as though by multiplying rituals the Victorians might stave off the world that threatened to replace them. Consider the weight of departure itself. To leave a room was not done casually, it was a ceremony. One curtsied at the threshold, a farewell embodied in posture. Even the dead, carried from their homes, were said to depart with the dignity of an unspoken bow, their coffins slipping through doors draped in black. Departure was always performance, always the acknowledgement of an audience. And so, when the century itself prepared to depart, when the long shadow of the Victorians stretched into the coming modern age, it too performed its exit with rehearsed precision, bowing not to individuals, but to the very idea of order. The final curtsy can be seen, if one knows where to look, in the smallest relics of that time, a pair of shoes aligned on a hearthrug, though no feet will wear them again. A letter sealed with wax long hardened, its contents forgotten, yet the seal itself still speaking of restraint. A parasol folded carefully and placed in a trunk, never to open under sunlight. Each object becomes a gesture frozen in time, as though the age itself paused mid-performance, never to resume. And yet, for all its silence, the Victorian world has never ceased to whisper. Walk down the streets of London, where soot still clings to the stones, and you can almost hear it, the rustle of skirts against cobblestones, the faint tapping of canes, the whisper of lace brushing parasol wood. These are not mere echoes of fashion, they are fragments of a vanished etiquette, rules so peculiar and so relentless that they carved grooves in the very air. To walk those streets is to walk among ghosts, not of individuals, but of behaviours, of rituals that once ruled like monarchs. But the curtsy, that lowering of the self, was not only a matter of bodies and knees. It was an entire philosophy of vanishing, one hid behind gloves, behind black crepe, behind half-drawn curtains, behind the measured angle of a teacup. Visibility was danger, invisibility was survival. To curtsy was to practice invisibility, to remind both others and oneself that one could disappear into respectability at will. It is perhaps no wonder that this age, so obsessed with being seen correctly, has left behind so many photographs of faces unsmiling, stiff, half-vanished already into history's shadow. And here lies the quiet terror of their world. They lived in fear not of violence alone, but of misinterpretation. A hat tipped too low, a knife crossed on a plate, a curtain drawn at the wrong hour. Each small slip could unravel the illusion of order. In a sense, every gesture was a curtsy, a small bow to the collective gaze, a submission to the invisible court of society. That court never adjourned, never slept, and so the Victorians curtsied endlessly, bowing not to monarchs alone, but to each other, to their neighbours, to the silent judgment of streets. But what becomes of a society when it bows too often, too deeply? It begins to fracture. Beneath the weight of all these rituals, cracks formed. Satirists mocked the absurdity of endless rules. Writers like Dickens and Wilde turned etiquette into stagecraft, exposing the cruelty beneath its polished surface. Servants whispered their own parodies, mocking the households that ordered them to open and close curtains with the precision of soldiers. The curtsy, once a symbol of dignity, became also a symbol of absurdity, a gesture so overused that it revealed the hollowness beneath. And then, slowly, inevitably, the world moved on. The 20th century opened its doors, and with it came new rhythms, new lights, new freedoms. Curtains were still drawn, but less was made of the hour. Gloves were worn, but increasingly for warmth, not morality. Morning black loosened its grip. Parasols folded and vanished. The great performance dimmed, the stage emptied, and the audience dispersed. What remained was only the faintest echo, the sense that once, long ago, even the smallest gesture had been a matter of survival. The final curtsy, then, was not performed in a ballroom or on a stage. It was performed in silence, in thousands of homes, in the gradual unlearning of rituals. A young woman walking into the new century no longer lowered her knees at every threshold. A man shook hands instead of tipping his hat into shadows. Families began to open their curtains without fear of comment. The vanishing was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, as though the entire age, exhausted from endless rehearsal, bowed once and slipped away. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, did they know, as they lived through it, that their world was fading? Did they sense that their endless etiquette, their odd and merciless rules, were the twilight of something rather than the dawn? Or did they believe, until the end, that the performance could go on forever, that curtsies and bows could hold back the tide of modernity? Perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that the gesture remains. We still feel it in language, in posture, in the strange, lingering expectation of politeness. We bow our heads slightly when passing strangers. We speak of drawing curtains. We sip from teacups with care. And somewhere in these echoes lies the shadow of a curtsy performed to a vanishing world. And so, as the lamplight fades and the streets fall silent, imagine the last act of that age. A woman standing at the edge of a drawing room, her skirt heavy, her gloves pale, her eyes lowered. She dips, slowly, gracefully, not for a person, but for an era. The bow is deep, the silence immense. And when she rises, the world she knew has gone. A final curtsy, and the century closes. And so, as the lamps fade and the carriages roll into silence, we leave behind a world ruled not by kings or queens alone, but by invisible gestures, the tilt of a hat, the shadow of a parasol, the weight of a bowed head. We walked through streets where silence spoke louder than words, where a teacup could destroy a reputation, where even the hour of drawing a curtain could decide how a family was remembered. These were the rules everyone knew, but few dared to question, rules that seem strange to us now, yet once decided who belonged and who vanished into scandal. But let me ask you, as we wandered through this vanished age together, which of these odd rituals struck you most deeply? Was it the silence of lowered eyes, the secret language of gloves, the quiet terror of being introduced or not being introduced at all? Which one felt less like history and more like a shadow still lingering in our own world today? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave them in the comments, along with your location and the time you're watching this. It is always haunting to see those replies appear, tiny sparks from across the world, like lanterns glowing against the dark, proof that even across time and distance, we are still connected by story. And if tonight's journey left you with a chill or a question that won't quite leave, make sure to subscribe before you go, because there are more shadows waiting in history and more stories still to tell. Until next time, keep your lamps lit and your eyes open.